In our last video, we explored hindsight bias, the tendency to see outcomes as having been more predictable after they occur than they actually were beforehand. At first glance, that phenomenon seems pretty simple. We learn how something turned out, and then we think, I knew it all along. But when psychologists began studying hindsight bias in the laboratory, they discovered that the phenomena is surprisingly complex. People sometimes misremember what they originally believed. Sometimes they become convinced that an outcome was inevitable. And sometimes they have difficulty imagining what it would be like not to know something that they now know. These findings raise an important question. Why does outcome knowledge change our judgments in the first place? Researchers have proposed several answers. Some explanations focus on memory, others emphasize reasoning and sense-making, and still others suggest that our motivations can sometimes influence these hindsight judgments. In this video, we'll look at the major theories that psychologists have developed to explain why the past so often seems predictable. To understand these theories, it helps to begin with the two major ways that researchers study hindsight bias. The first is called the memory paradigm. In the memory paradigm, people make a prediction, they then learn the outcome, and then later are asked to remember what they originally thought. If their remembered judgment shifts toward the actual outcome, they're showing hindsight bias. The second paradigm is called the hypothetical paradigm. Here, people never make an original prediction at all. Instead, one group knows the outcome and another group does not. The two groups are then asked to judge how likely the outcome was. If the group that knows the outcome sees it as more likely or more inevitable, they are showing hindsight bias. These two approaches are important because they suggest that hindsight bias cannot be explained by a single process. Some findings clearly involve memory, others occur even when there is no earlier judgment to remember. Let's start with memory-based explanations. Memory theories were developed primarily to explain findings from the memory paradigm, situations in which people make a judgment, learn the outcome, and are later asked to remember what they originally believed. At first, hindsight bias might seem like a simple memory failure. Maybe people just forgot what they originally thought. But the evidence suggests something more interesting. Psychologists generally agree that memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. When we remember an earlier belief or judgment, we don't simply replay a stored recording. Instead, we actively reconstruct that memory using whatever information is available to us in the present. And one piece of information that may now be available is the outcome itself. Imagine that you estimated the age at which Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa. Later, you learn the correct answer and are asked to remember your original estimate. Your recollection may shift toward the correct answer, not because you're intentionally changing your response, but because your memory is being reconstructed in light of new information. One influential explanation of this process is the selective activation, reconstruction, and anchoring model, or SARA model, proposed by Carl Tegan and colleagues and later developed by Ralph Hertwig, Kai Pohl, and their collaborators. According to SARA, information in memory is organized as a network of associated ideas. Learning an outcome selectively activates information that's consistent with that outcome. In the Mandela example, learning that he became president at age 75 might make information such as his white hair or advanced age more accessible in memory. Later, when you reconstruct your original estimate, that highly activated information serves as an anchor and pulls your remembered judgment toward the correct answer. A second memory model was proposed by Ulrich Hoffridge, Ralph Hertwig, and colleagues, And this is known as the Reconstruction After Feedback with Take the Best. I know it's a mouthful, or for short, RAFT. RAFT begins with an important assumption. Sometimes we can directly retrieve our original judgment, and sometimes we cannot. If we cannot retrieve it, we have to effectively reconstruct that judgment using probability cues. These are pieces of information that tend to be associated with a particular answer. For example, when estimating the population of a city, you might rely on cues such as whether it has a professional sports team, a major airport, or a large university. These probability cues can help you then make a better estimate of that population. The crucial idea is that learning an outcome can update the values we assign to those cues. Then, when we reconstruct our original judgment, we unknowingly use information that we did not actually possess at the time of the original judgment. The result of this is hindsight bias. Although SARA and RAFT differ in their details, they share an important conclusion. Hindsight bias can emerge from perfectly ordinary memory processes. Our memories are continually updated in light of new information, and that adaptive process can sometimes make us poor historians of our own earlier beliefs. Memory theories such as SARA and RAFT are quite successful at explaining hindsight bias in the memory paradigm, but they encounter an important challenge. People also show hindsight bias in situations where there's no earlier judgment to remember. In one of Baruch Fischoff's classic studies, participants read a brief description of a 19th century conflict between the British and the Gurkhas of Nepal. Different groups of participants received exactly the same background information about the conflict, but some participants were also told how the conflict ended. For example, one group learned the British won, while another group received no outcome information. Participants were then asked to estimate how likely various outcomes would have seemed before the conflict took place. Consistently, people who knew that the British won judged a British victory to have been more likely than did the people who never learned the outcome. This design is called the hypothetical paradigm because the participants never made an original prediction that could be remembered or reconstructed. There's no earlier judgment to remember. Yet hindsight bias still occurs. So if people never made an earlier prediction, what exactly is changing? According to Edward Wasserman, Richard Lampert, and Reed Hasty, outcome knowledge changes the way people think about the event itself. Once participants know the British won, information about British military organization, resources, or strategic advantages may suddenly seem more important and more causally relevant. These details can then be connected into what Wasserman and his colleagues called a commonsense causal bridge, a coherent explanation that links earlier events to the known outcome. And once that causal bridge is constructed, the outcome itself begins to seem increasingly predictable and inevitable. These ideas led to the development of causal model theory. According to this theory, outcome knowledge changes the way people think about an event by highlighting the information that is causally relevant to the known outcome. In other words, knowing the ending changes which details seem important. In this view, hindsight bias is not primarily a memory phenomenon. It's a sense-making problem. Humans have a powerful tendency to organize information into coherent causal stories. Later work by Tyler Pezzo and Stephen Nestler expanded this idea into what they call a sense-making model of hindsight bias. According to this model, hindsight bias unfolds in several stages. First, people search for possible causes of an outcome. Second, They evaluate whether those causes provide a satisfying explanation. And third, if the explanation succeeds, they experience what Fishoff called a creeping determinism, the feeling that the outcome wasn't just understandable, but this is the inevitable outcome from those causes. Notice something important here. According to the sense-making account, merely knowing an outcome is not always sufficient to produce hindsight bias. The outcome also has to make sense. If people cannot construct a plausible explanation for why the outcome occurred, hindsight bias may be substantially reduced. In fact, researchers such as Yapchik and Kim have shown that when information is needed to construct a causal explanation, and then it's removed from a scenario, hindsight bias is often weakened or eliminated. This finding is important because it suggests that hindsight bias is not simply a passive consequence of learning an outcome. Instead, people actively work to understand events. And once they succeed in building a convincing explanation, the outcome itself can begin to feel obvious. This perspective also helps explain why hindsight bias is so common in everyday life. After an election, a business failure, or a surprising scientific discovery, we quickly begin constructing stories about why it happened. The resulting explanations may be perfectly reasonable. The problem is that they're constructed with the benefit of knowing the ending. And that knowledge can make the path toward the outcome appear much clearer than it actually was. The theories we've discussed so far assume that hindsight bias is primarily a cognitive phenomenon. But some researchers have proposed that hindsight judgments can also be influenced by motivation. One of the earliest motivational explanations was proposed by Elaine Walster. Walster suggested that people have a general desire to see the world as orderly and predictable. From this perspective, believing that an outcome was foreseeable may help preserve a sense that events occur for understandable reasons rather than chance. A related idea was later advanced by Tyler Pezzo. Pezzo argued that hindsight judgments may sometimes serve self-evaluative functions. If an outcome now seems obvious, people infer that they understood the situation better than they actually did, or that they possessed greater insight than they actually had. These motivational accounts make an interesting prediction. If hindsight bias serves to enhance the functions of competence or of control, then the bias should not occur uniformly across all situations. Instead, the direction and magnitude of hindsight judgment should depend on what is psychologically advantageous. For example, suppose an outcome is highly negative and personally threatening. In that situation, claiming that the outcome was predictable might imply responsibility for failing to prevent it. A motivational account would therefore predict that people may instead emphasize the unpredictability of the event. This prediction has received some empirical support. For example, Mark and Meller found that workers who had been laid off often viewed the layoffs as less foreseeable in retrospect, a pattern that's difficult to explain solely in terms of self-enhancement. Findings such as these suggest that motivational factors can sometimes shape hindsight judgments, particularly when outcomes have important implications for someone's self-evaluation, responsibility, or perceptions of control. At the same time, motivational accounts face an important challenge. Hindsight bias is observed in many situations that involve little personal investment, little threat to self-esteem, and no obvious self-enhancing motive. As a result, most researchers do not view motivational process as the primary explanation for hindsight bias. Instead, the current consensus is that hindsight bias is fundamentally a cognitive phenomenon, although motivational factors can sometimes strengthen, weaken, or even reverse the effect under particular circumstances. All right, let's pull all these theories together. At this point, it should be clear that hindsight bias is not explained by a single mechanism. Different theories were developed to explain different findings. Memory theories, such as SARA and RAFT, are particularly useful for explaining hindsight bias in the memory paradigm, where people make an initial judgment, learn an outcome, and later reconstruct their earlier beliefs. Causal model theory and sense-making approaches are especially useful in explaining hindsight bias in the hypothetical paradigm, where people show hindsight bias when there's no earlier judgment to remember. Motivational accounts remind us that hindsight judgments do not occur in a vacuum. People's goals, concerns, and self-evaluations can sometimes shape the direction and magnitude of those hindsight effects. At first, these theories might seem to compete with one another. But remember, psychology often works differently than that. As many of you have heard me say, a useful saying in science is all models are wrong, but some are useful. Thank you, George Box. Every theory simplifies reality. No model captures every aspect of a psychological phenomenon. Instead, these theories are useful to the extent that they help us explain the observations, generate predictions, and identify important mechanisms. From this perspective, hindsight bias is probably best understood as a multicausal phenomenon. Memory processes, causal reasoning, and motivational factors can all contribute to the way people reconstruct and interpret the past. The relative importance of these processes may depend on the situation, the type of hindsight task being studied, and the questions researchers are asking. Despite these differences, all of these theories point to the same general conclusion. Learning an outcome changes the way we think about what came before. The past does not remain simply fixed and waiting to be remembered. Instead, our memories, explanations, and evaluations are often reconstructed in light of what we now know. And that reconstruction can make outcomes seem more predictable than they actually were.